Al, I think you started in 1973. I had started in 72. My recollection is that it was really only in 1972 that the State Department started the cone system. Until that time, everybody was a Foreign Service generalist. And the idea was you could go from being a general services officer in Moscow to being a trade officer in Geneva at the GATT, and then you'd go do, run the visa section in Santiago or something like that. And I think, it really, a lot of good commercial and economic work was done before that time, but it was really only in the 70s that I think as the world started to get more complex and interrelated that the State Department realized that it needed to focus, specifically on it and recruit and train people for that. Chuck, your experience is at Commerce, before you became an ambassador. What's your perspective on commercial diplomacy, economic diplomacy, and where it's been and where it's headed?
Thanks, Sean, for the question. First of all, it's great to be together again after some years.
Yeah.
It's been a privilege in my career. 2 or 3 times our paths kind of crossed as we sorted out some of these same questions.
Exactly,
economic
or
and commercial
didn't
diplomacy,
sort out.
Or didn't
yes.
sort it out at times. But, and again, to AFSA for the opportunity to be here. It's incredibly timely from my perspective, the conversation, given what's going on in the global economic situation and looking at it commercially, whether you're talking about the President's National Export Initiative or his now request to examine 12 agencies to see how we could be more effective and efficient. It's exciting and a dynamic time once again. I, to put it in context, I guess, joined in 1982 from the private sector. So I was part of that first wave of private sector people that came into the Foreign Commercial Service as it was being constituted at the Commerce Department in that transfer period.
As it had been earlier at the State Department and was moved under the 1979 Trade Acts, I think.
1980 Foreign Service Act,
Yeah.
1970, or Reorganization Plan number 3. But from a historic point of view, I think, first of all, it's interesting to try to, perhaps today, if you want to, with questions, we can thread out the differences between commercial and economic. They're very connected, and in my mind, we often talk about them a little bit like if commerce wants to take a lead, it's commercial diplomacy, and if state does, it's economic diplomacy, rather than, I think, the broad issues of economics, as Al framed them, are what is the framework discussion, and within that economic diplomacy, there's a very specific set of activities that I think relate to the commercial diplomacy piece or the support for U.S. business. And it's been interesting to see how that has changed over the years, or maybe unfortunately hasn't changed. You all have been, or many of you have been at embassies, and sometimes we're seen in the commercial side as a set of services that are provided to companies that arrive, and that's true. But at its best, the public policy rationale for why we exist is important to understand within the broader framework of economic diplomacy, which is to address a market imperfection that creates the need for government programs and support because the marketplace isn't able to do this for American companies. And we can talk about that, but I think that's been one of the rationales over the years. And the idea of having a direct focus on 2 things, the statute tells us: expanding exports, particularly from small and medium-sized companies. That's a comma that often isn't fully appreciated, the challenge of helping small and medium-sized U.S. business, and advancing U.S. commercial interests. And what do those look like? So from my career perspective, and I want to maybe say a few things about looking forward, but it was interesting coming in at the end of the 70s, early 80s, when I would suggest the first kind of breaks in the consensus view on trade were beginning to appear in the American public as to, this was pretty easy consensus in the 50s and 60s, but the 70s started to produce some strains that relate to the broader macroeconomic world that Al was talking about. And to go through that period and have the next big wave or interesting time for me was when the wall came down, and you had this rather exciting period of expanding into the former Soviet Union, big emerging markets, advocacy guidelines, when our 2 departments worked very closely together, then Secretary Eagleberger and my boss at the time, Sue Schwab, to create guidelines so that ambassadors would know that they could be aggressive in supporting American business and under what conditions. And I think now it's interesting looking at this moment with the whole global economic situation, the way it might be, the need to use, I guess, the term rebalancing of economies, all economic diplomacy, but within that will be the challenge for many countries, including our own, to how to export more, how to do that efficiently and effectively, and where is there a role for government in that process. And I think that's one of the things that those of us that are working on the National Export Initiative try to grapple with, is how to be effective in confronting that situation. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but the commercial diplomacy piece really to me is a important subset of the broader economic diplomacy and has connectivity in both directions. Whether it's the direct role we're playing to expand commercial, to expand exports or commercial interests, or frankly where I've seen it used as a diplomatic tool more directly in the peace process in Northern Ireland or in other venues where the commercial diplomacy is a leader for you, some of the nation building that might be going on in parts of the world. You want to have the business piece in there both for U.S. interests but for broader nation building goals. So those are some early thoughts.
Okay, thanks.